84. 84th Psalm. Read the entire psalm. How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts! My soul longeth, yea, even fainteth, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. Yea, the sparrow hath found a house, and the swallow a nest for herself, where she may lay her young, even thine altars, O Lord of hosts, my King and my God. Blessed are they that dwell in thy house. They will be still praising thee, Selah. Blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, and whose heart are the ways of them, who passing through the valley of Baca make it a well. The rain also filleth the pools. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them in Zion appeareth before God. O Lord God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob, Selah. Behold, O God our shield, look upon the face of thine anointed. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. For the Lord God is a sun and shield. The Lord will give grace and glory. No good thing will he withhold from them that walk uprightly. O Lord of hosts, blessed is the man that trusteth in thee. You'll notice that the inscription of the psalm is to the chief musician. That is, the music leader or director of worship upon gittith, which was some sort of musical instrument. And then we see it as a psalm for the sons of Korah. These were Levites from the family of Korath, and they served in the temple worship, and they were known for praising the Lord. Their ancestor, Korah, led a rebellion of 250 against Moses back in the wilderness days, and we read of that in Numbers chapter 16. And Korah and the 250 died, but his sons were spared. And we read that in Numbers chapter 26. And perhaps these who were spared through time were so grateful for God's mercies that they became known for their praise in the house of God. The subject of the psalm is the public place of worship. And we preached upon the church last Sunday as well. Introduced by the opening words, verse 1, how amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts. The tone of the psalm is set in the very first word, how, used to express a strong feeling. Here would be a feeling of amazement and wonder. As you read on, the psalmist is enamored with the public place of worship. In this psalm, the psalmist, who is unknown, by the way, is expressing his fascination, his affection, his desire, his appreciation, his inclination, his regard for the house of God. And we pray that we can identify with him. Our subject is a passionate longing for God's house. A passionate longing for God's house. I want to consider, first of all, how the psalmist views the God-appointed place of public worship. In the psalm, we find the words, Thy tabernacles, verse 1, the courts of the Lord, verse 2, Thy courts, verse 10, Thy house, verse 4, and the house of my God. With those words, he's speaking of the God-appointed place of worship. Going back to the Old Testament, of course. The God-appointed place of worship in the Old Testament. Now, in the Old Testament, there was the tabernacle, and later this would be replaced by the temple. Both were designed by God, and both were the special place where the Israelite could meet with and worship God. So they are a God-ordained special place. Both the tabernacle and the temple were places where God's glory were displayed. Both the tabernacle and the temple serve as types of the Lord's church, which is referred to in Ephesians 2:21, 2:22 as a habitation of God through the Spirit, a dwelling place of God. It's not that God is confined there. God is omnipresent. But you can find God there because He dwells there in a special way. And in 1 Timothy 3:15, it's called the house of God, which is the church of the living God. So just as the tabernacle and the temple were God ordained, God prepared, special places of God's dwelling where God's people could meet with and worship God. So it is with the Lord's church today. So for you and I, as we read this psalm, we can view it as speaking of the Lord's church or the Lord's churches. So again, let's see how he views this place. He views it as a special place of congregation. In verse 1, you have the word tabernacles, meaning tents, dwellings, meeting place, a place of congregation. The words, the tabernacle of the congregation, the tabernacle of the congregation, appears 133 times in the Old Testament. It's referring to the tabernacle, the temple. In verses 2 and 10 of this psalm, we read courts, referring to a set-apart place dedicated to holy adoration. In verses 4 and 10, is referred to as a house, also a dwelling and meeting place. He also views this place of congregation, he views it in relation to the Lord. Notice in verse 1, it is thy tabernacles. In verse 2, the courts of the Lord. In verse 10, it is thy courts. In verse 4, it is thy house. And in verse 10, it is the house of my God. So these are declarations that this place of worship cannot be separated from God. It's His. God is the owner. It is not an institution of man. The tabernacle was not an institution. It was not an invention of man. It was of God. The temple was not the invention of man. It was of God. God was the designer, and so it is with the Lord's church. The fact that He refers to it as the Lord's means that God has a chosen place. God has a special place. God has a place that is set apart, a place of distinction, a primary place of importance, where He will meet with His people. It's not like it's the only place He'll meet with His people. We realize that. But it is a special meeting place. The specialty of this place is seen by how God is viewed. Again, it belongs to God. It's thy tabernacles, thy courts, the house of the Lord. And the specialty of that is seen how God is viewed throughout the psalm. He is referred to as Lord 7 times in Psalm 84. Jehovah, all capital letters, emphasizing His self-existence, His immutability. And there is a place where God's people can congregate and meet with Jehovah. He is referred to as God 8 times in this psalm. Elohim, a strong and faithful one, conveying the idea that He is able, He is loyal, He is constant, He is true, He is dependable. And this is the place where His people can congregate and meet with Him. That makes it a very special place. He is referred to as the Lord of hosts 3 times in this psalm, verse 1, verse 3, and verse 12. And in verse 8, it is the Lord God of hosts. Again, a title of sovereignty. It declares that God reigns. God reigns supreme with absolute authority and control. And in verse 3, it is the Lord of hosts, my King. And this is where His people can congregate and meet with the Lord of hosts, with our King. He is referred to 1 time, verse 8, as the God of Jacob, the one who singles out the most unlikely and unworthy objects to be fashioned into vessels of glory. The God of Jacob is a God of patience. He is a God of compassion. The God of Jacob is one who meets with the sinner to bless him, and who goes to great lengths to mold and make something of the sinner. The God of Jacob is the one who can overhaul and transform lives. He's the God of transforming power. The God of Jacob is the one who can give the sinner new beginnings. And this is where His people can congregate and meet with the God of Jacob. This is the place where God's people can congregate and meet with the God of Jacob. Well, I'm not going to be there. I'm depressed today. Well, this is the dwelling place of the God of Jacob, the one who transforms. You ought to go out of your way to meet in the place where the God of Jacob is. Well, I feel unworthy. He's the God of Jacob. He's the God of the unworthy. And this is a place where God's people can meet with Him. Verse 9, He's referred to as our shield. That is, He's our guard. He's our defense. He's our cover. He's our security. And this is where God's people can congregate and meet with Him. Verse 11, He is a sun, S-U-N, the one who communicates light and warmth. Also in verse 11, He's the giver of grace. The Lord will give grace and glory. And this is the place where God's people can congregate and meet with Him. He views it also as a place of refuge. In verse 3, the psalmist says, yea. Again, meaning more than this. That is, more than what I said in verses 1 and 2. Or not only so, referring back to verses 1 and 2, but, yea, followed by an observation. In this case, of the sparrow and swallow. And the sparrow and swallow, he goes on to say, have found a home. And they've built a nest in the public place of worship. A secret place, far away from the distractions in mainstream. Far away from the predator. Far away from the storms and the winds. It says the sparrow hath found a house, and the swallow a nest for herself. The sparrow is a bird of small significance. The swallow is a bird of restlessness. Going back to the sparrow, the insignificant can find their place in the house of God. And the restless person can find their nest in the house of the Lord. It is a protective place. The sparrow and the swallow, as they build their house and their nest in the tabernacle or temple, they're in a protective place. In this world, there's persecution. There's hatred. There's malice. There's opposition. But the Lord's house is a place of safety. It's a place of security. A place where one can raise their family. Notice the swallow a nest for herself where she may lay her young. Where she may lay her young. This speaks of a place of love. A place of care. A place of instruction. A place of growth. A place where one can call home. God's ordained, set apart, and prepared place for His people. Living in this world, this is a place where they can come and congregate and meet with Him. Oh, what a place. Oh, what a place. He views it as a happy place. Notice verse 4. Blessed, happy, are they that dwell. Now here he would be talking about the priests. They that dwell or inhabit, remain, continue, and abide in thy house. And then notice, they will be still praising thee. The world is full of cursing. Filthy, that which is filthy and vile and disgusting and degrading. Abominable talk. But in the house of the Lord, there is continuous praise to God. And this is where His people can congregate and meet with Him. He views it also as a miraculous place. Again, tabernacles, courts, house, places of congregation, and the very fact that we can congregate in His tabernacles, His courts, His house, speaks of His grace, His mercy, His love, and make it a gracious place, a merciful place, a loving place. In addition, verse 3, he speaks of thine altars. The altar, the altars of the tabernacle speak of a belief in God. Speaks of the realization of personal need of God. It speaks of a desire for God. The altars speak of submission to God, sacrifice to God, worship of God. The altars speak of communion with God. From verse 7, there is appearance before God. They go from strength to strength. Every one of them in Zion appeareth before God. This is a place where you can appear before God. And in verse 8, there is prayer. O Lord God of hosts, hear my prayer. Give ear, O God of Jacob. Selah. All of this speaks of the miraculous. And this is where His people can congregate and meet with Him. A miraculous place. He also views it as a fulfilling place. Verse 10, we hear Him say, a day in thy courts is better than. Better than just kind of jumps off the page. Better than 1,000. The words better than conveys the idea of more advantageous, more suitable, more appropriate, more useful, more valuable. He states this as a matter of fact. A day in thy courts is positively better than 1,000. He states it as a matter of fact. He states it as a matter of certainty. He states it as a matter of conviction. He states it as a matter that he knows. He says, one single day worshiping the Lord in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 anywhere else. Now, there aren't many that believe that today. I do believe it. One day in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 days. That is, it is better than 2 years and 9 months anywhere else. Again, there aren't many who believe that. Those who miss and say, well, it's just one service. Is that all it is? Is that all it is? Just one service? Well, the psalmist says it's better than 1,000 days anywhere else. So is that all it is? Just one service? You see, when someone says that, they've said a mouthful. They've said an awful lot. And it's not good. That's just one service. Really? Do you realize the value of one service? If you could ask Thomas, ask him about one service. One service is better than 1,000 days anywhere else. A day in thy courts is better than 1,000. One day worshiping the Lord in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 days of family reunions. Do you believe that? One day worshiping the Lord in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 days of recreation. Better than 1,000 days out on the lake. Better than 1,000 days out in the woods. Better than 1,000 days at the amusement park, or the ballpark, or the golf course, or at work. Well, I'm getting time and a half. I'm getting double time. One day in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 days of double time at work. Now, people don't believe that today. But it's so. It's so. And I believe he's understated it. There are not many that believe what it says here. But it's true nevertheless. How often God's people declare by their actions that something else is better than meeting in the Lord's house on the Lord's day. They declare that by their actions. They're saying, this is better than me being in the Lord's house. And many so strongly believe that it is better than being in the Lord's house, they don't even listen online. And I'm not saying by any means, and I hope no one has this thought process in their mind because it's inaccurate and it's erroneous. Listening online is not the same. And it's not having church. You have to assemble to have church. And you have to assemble at the God-ordained place to have church. It's a good thing for the sick to be able to listen online, but it's not church. It's not church. And many choose to be gone, and they can't even bother to listen online. So what are they saying? They're saying, well, what I'm doing is better than being in the Lord's house. I've been coming to the Lord's house, His church, for about 50 years. Not occasionally. Not every other week. Not once a month. Not once every couple months. But every time the church doors are open. That is about 2,600 Sundays, 2,600 Wednesdays. That's a total of 5,200 times. And each one of those times is better than 1,000 days anywhere else. That's what it says. So, do a little math. 5,200 days, and really it's been more than that. 5,200 days times 1,000. That is 5,200,000 days. That's a lot of days. That's more days than I can live. 5,200,000 days. My 5,200 days in the Lord's house is better than 5,200,000 days anywhere else. Now, my days spent in the Lord's house, 5,200,000 days, that means that's better than approximately 14,246 years. That's living. That's living. My life is equivalent to just the days in the Lord's house, 14,246 years. That is a full life. That's a full life. That's a blessed life. You that have brought your children to church, every time the church doors were open, and those that do so now, don't ever feel guilty about bringing them to church every time the church doors are open. And don't ever apologize to your children for it. They may not appreciate it, but don't you dare apologize for it. There's nothing to apologize for. You've provided them an abundant life, because one day is better than 1,000. He also views it as a place apart from the world. In verse 5 and 6, blessed is the man whose strength is in thee, and whose heart are the ways of them, who passing through the valley of Baca make it a well, the rain also filleth the pools. Zion, well, let's read verse 7. They go from strength to strength, every one of them in Zion appeareth before God. Zion, that's the location of God's house, the temple. It's Jerusalem. It was situated on a hill or a mountain. And this valley of Baca had to be passed through in order to reach the public place of worship, the house of God. Baca, which is probably the valley of Bochin, but Baca means tears. They passed through the valley of tears to get to Zion, to get to the house of God. It speaks of that which is difficult. It's a painful place. But it is the passageway to the place of worship. You got to go through the valley of Baca to get there. Every time we congregate, we had to pass through this world to get here. Every one of us. Throughout the week, passing through Baca to get here. And when we arrive here, Satan is defeated. And oh, what a joy to come to this place and know that each one who got here through the valley of this world, each one got here through the valley of this world. We are here in spite of the obstacles. Oh, it doesn't take many obstacles to deter many. One obstacle, and that can be imagined in their head, will keep them from the house of God. But if you have a longing, you'll get through to get to that place. So in spite of the obstacles, in spite of the challenges, in spite of the giants, in spite of the problems, in spite of the complications, in spite of the battles and the struggles, they arrive at the house of God. And that's true of all of us here today. We had to pass through the valley of Baca. Well, I won't be there. I've had a rough week. Oh, if you only knew how rough it's been. Oh, you see, if you had a strong, longing passion for the house of God, you get through it. And you arrive at the house of the Lord. So each one that is here has had to pass through the valley of Baca. It's no wonder that we read in the New Testament, greet one another with a holy kiss. Glad to see one another because we know they've had to pass through the valley to get here. So the very fact that we're here speaks of the miraculous. So we see the psalmist's view of the place that God has set apart as the place to meet with God and to worship Him. And then we come to verse 1. And we hear him say, "How amiable are thy tabernacles, O Lord of hosts." Meaning delightful and pleasing. Oh, how delightful! How pleasing it is to be in God's house. It was a place where he found gratification. He found extreme satisfaction, great personal pleasure. This was a place that he found fascinating. It was a place that captivated him. The word amiable conveys the idea of lovely, dear, warmth, pleasantness, agreeable. It's a sad day when the house of God is not agreeable to your mood. That's a sad place to be. He's saying that he sees great beauty. And he finds great benefit and blessing and pleasure in the God-appointed public place of worship. To what degree? One day is better than 1,000. One day is better than 1,000. He's enamored with the God-appointed place of worship. He sees it as a beautiful place. It's a place that he relishes. Now notice the longing of the psalmist in verse 2. "My soul longeth, yea, more than that, even fainteth, for the courts of the Lord. My heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God." This speaks of a consuming desire. In these words, there's great emotion. He's expressing love. He's expressing attachment to God's house. Devotion to God's house. Some are so attached that they'll be here if there's nothing else going on. Oh, that's not very attached, is it? Oh, we miss being there. I'm sorry. I don't buy it. I wasn't born yesterday. Don't buy it. Note the words, my soul, my heart, my flesh. They speak of the depth of his longing. Notice also the words there in verse 2, longeth, fainteth, crieth. It speaks of the intensity of his longing. It is his view of the house of God that feeds his desire and longing for such. And it gets him through the valley of Baca. He not only longs for the courts of the Lord, but notice, verse 2, my heart and my flesh crieth out for the living God. He desires and longs for the God of the house. That's what makes the house so special. He's the God of the house. A desire and longing for God's house is driven by a desire and longing for God. You try as hard as you want, you can't separate the two. You can't separate them. Now notice concerning this desire. It is a desire and longing of priority. Verse 10, I had rather. I prefer. I had rather be. Okay, that's a state of being. That's not talking about doing yet. The state of being comes first. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my God than dwell in the tents of wickedness. A doorkeeper was the lowest place in the house of God. He says, one day in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 anywhere else. And besides that, I'd rather be in the lowest place in God's house than be anywhere else. I'd rather be a doorkeeper. The psalmist is saying, I'd rather be this than anything else. I'd rather be a doorkeeper in the house of the Lord. A doorkeeper is not a place of prominence, but that's what he'd rather take the lowest place. He sees the house of God as a place of great privilege in those words. It's a great privilege to be in the Lord's house. Again, I've been with a lot of people on their deathbed. I have yet to hear a single person say, oh, Brother Dan, I wish I wouldn't have gone to church so much. I've yet to hear that. And I'm never going to hear that. I've had many say, oh, should have been in church more. Yeah, you should have. If you're going to expect me to argue with that, that's not going to happen. Yeah, you should have. But guess what? It's too late now. Life of regret. But if one day in the Lord's house is better than 1,000 and I spend my life there, there's no regrets there. There's no regrets. It is a desire and longing that pushes through. We see this in verses 6 and 7. On the way to God's house, they're passing through the valley of Baca. They pass through the valley of difficulties and obstacles and hurdles and enemies and battles. But none of these things extinguish his desire and longing for God's house. Again, you see them. They're on their way to the house of God, passing through the valley of Baca. In verse 8 says they go from strength to strength. Now normally if you're on a journey, you go from strength to weakness. You don't start out strong and just get stronger and stronger. But here the longing and the desire to be in God's house gives them more and more strength. And He gives them the ability to push through the valley of Baca as they make their way to the house of God. Because of the intensity of their desire and the intensity of their longing, they're getting stronger and stronger, and they pursue being in the house of God. Nothing can stop them. Whatever happens in the valley of Baca, they press through. And they're in the house of God. What's so sad today is that God's people, when you have someone like that, I've seen people suffering with cancer, and they get to the house of God. They're there all the time. They don't feel well. I'm not talking about anybody that's sick and has germs. That's not what I'm talking about. But someone's suffering, but they're there. And God's people, oh, I've never seen such faithful. That's sad. That's sad. You realize how sad that is? That is a remarkable thing. It should be ordinary. It should be what we do. Got to get to the Lord's house. I can remember preaching a revival. I won't say the church. And there was a man, way up in years, had cancer. And every church service, my understanding was they did this every Sunday and every Wednesday, but every night of that meeting, Monday through Sunday, they brought him in the hospital bed, carried it up some steps, wheeled it into the back of the church, and there he lay. Passing through the valley of Baca to get to the house of God. Oh, that's the way it ought to be. Do not let the world, do not let life drain your desire and longing for God's house. Our desire and longing for God's house ought to be stronger than whatever happens in life. It's like the Psalms of Ascent, Psalm 120 to Psalm 134. The enthusiasm ought to be building and growing as you pass through this world to get to God's house. May our desire and longing for God's house be so intense that it cannot be consumed by life. And I realize things happen where you just can't be here. I understand that. So strong and intense that life doesn't get in the way. May our desire and longing for God and His house be so strong and intense that it grows through the week. That it grows through the week as we pass through. It gives us more strength to pass through the valley of Baca to get to God's house. Because everyone who makes it to God's house on the Lord's day has passed through this world to do it. You can't bypass the world. It's where we live. You have to pass through it. Well, I had a bad week. I won't be there. I got a phone call and it upset me. I won't be there. Don't have much desire. Don't have much desire. Oh, may God give us the desire stronger than the valley of Baca to be in the Lord's house. Brother Ben, if you'll come and lead us